Hello and welcome to the Daily Brown Bag. Today we're talking about the future of news. I'm Chad Hill and I'm joined by Adam Stetzer.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chad. Welcome to the Brown Bag. We talk about news all the time, Chad, and we've covered news jacking, and we've talked about using news as a vehicle for digital marketing and specifically for SEO. But today we're covering a very interesting article from the American Journalism Review, written by Paul Sparrow, who is a senior VP at the Newseum in Washington, D.C., also an award-winning journalist. And he's talking about how the future of news lies in data. So coming at this from the journalist side, and I think this is a very interesting concept for us to talk about and explore today, Chad, as we think about where the internet's going. He talks about some really interesting concepts describing this semantic web, and this is the internet, of the future, that analyzes all sorts of things about us, things we've linked to, content we've looked at, connections we have with other people. We've certainly talked about this a great deal, Chad, in the context of Facebook and the social graph, and we know Google's been trying to get at some of this data. Recently we covered how Amazon is a big competitor in some of these spaces. And what Sparrow describes here, he's got these points laid out, which he calls the 4 horsemen of the techpocalypse, very hard word to say, which is basically where is this all evolving and what data points are going to be used to drive the news. And basically the idea is that what we're going to see in the news is going to be very highly adapted based on the data that is known about us. And these 4 different areas he talks about is the Internet of Things, which I've heard of, and you've probably heard of, Chad, probably more in technology discussions. This is the network of devices that are all connected, talking about things in our houses, thermostats, fitness trackers, our cars eventually. Location tracking, which has obviously become so much bigger with the explosion in mobile. Wearable computers, which I think mobile smartphones probably count, and of course Google Glass and smartwatches are starting to come onto the market, and the semantic web. And he says if you were to study all these things and really think about where things are going, you'll come to this very startling conclusion, which is the news organizations are actually not competing with each other, but are actually competing with tech companies like Google and Facebook, who really have a lot of this data and are very good at manipulating it and using it right now to sell ads, but will be increasingly using it to sell and move news. So I think that's an interesting premise, Chad, and I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, it is a very interesting evolution of things, and it's we kind of talk about these unlikely competitors. We were talking about Google and Amazon. Here's another case, more of an industry analysis, but he talks about how this is kind of a dangerous path about media companies moving towards data collection. They haven't historically done this. They've been all about creating one story that meets the general needs of the wider audience and then distributing that in a pretty good way. But in this case, really, as you said, people like Google and Facebook have really become the matchmakers of collecting this information. As you said, started off with advertising, but we've read and heard more and more about what Facebook is doing with its news feed, certainly what Google is doing with personalization, more on the Android side of things, but really putting all this data together to give people an interesting, to give them the most relevant information. I think what it means for journalists or what he talks about in terms of media and journalists is that they need to be better at really delivering the right message for a specific user. So rather than this general content, need to make sure they need to move more towards creating content that's relevant for the particular story that they're covering, which is definitely hard and expensive when you have a whole mechanism and whole company built around printed journalism. It's very hard to weave in the multimedia type of things. And then I guess the other thing that we wanted to mention is that we talked about some of this earlier this year about this idea of content shock, that there's this we've already there or getting close to this point where there's just so much content that we can't possibly sort it out ourselves, and so we now have to start relying on technology to help us sort out and curate this content. And the big question here is, historically, that's been, in the case of a New York Times or Fox News, the New York Times famously, all the news fit to print. It's all about them curating it for you. Now what we're saying is, will technology take its place and do that curation? So it's very interesting, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, and it's actually futuristic. If you let your brain kind of ponder this a little bit, Chad, it's sort of like artificial intelligence deciding what information you start to see. and that's very futuristic. And I think the last note is not to forget that Jeff Bezos from Amazon recently purchased the Washington Post, so more data points that support that a lot of this stuff's going to be merging in the news industry. Well, that's our coverage today of this very interesting article. Thank you for watching our Brown Bag. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd also ask that you subscribe.